9, 8.
You're watching The Experience, Comic Culture and Sales. Streaming live daily to Facebook, YouTube, Twitch, and Twitter.
2, 1.
So last week, must have been Tuesday night, I sent Bronze a message, sort of bemoaning other peer professionals in this business and their lack of ability to think about systems development. Bronze knows, anybody who knows me at all knows that I love systems. I love to make a system and then run everything through that system because it keeps everything the same. And the system I was complaining about was I found some books that I've had in my collection now for a number of years that are signed by a number of creatives. I don't have any real ties to those books anymore. I keep them, but if I can sell them and make a few bucks, I'm going to sell them. So I go out to retailers that I know and friends in the business and say, how do you price signatures? And the number of them that responded with, I just go to eBay and look at what people are charging on eBay and charge that, would make you want to punch straight through your computer monitor. Because it was almost universal. And anytime I would bring up, hey, did you know that you can ask whatever you want on eBay? So that's not really an actual representation of the value of these signatures. Well, that's how we do it. There's no system in place. And that led to a bigger conversation about the value of a signed book or the value of a signature. And how I have a certain belief as it comes to signatures on books. And Bronze has a certain belief as it comes to signatures on books. And come to find out, a large portion of the collectors community has a different belief when it comes to signatures on books. And so that led me to this question. Do signatures matter? This is Devil's Advocates. What's up, the internet? It's producer Kyle. How's it going? Ooh. Could you hear that just now?
Mm-mm.
Okay, good. That means the noise cancellation is working.
Ooh.
That's Bronze Age Nerd.
Hello.
And this is Devil's Advocates. What's up, Bronze?
Not too much, except for everything signed apparently is up right now.
It's true.
Yeah, it is absolutely interesting how this topic's unfolded from a humble beginning of a really real world problem, like you mentioned in the opening there. And I think that is absolutely something that is a valid point. Something I've wondered about too is you could kind of have a larger conversation about value in comics in general, because that whole, hey, that's what they're selling it for on eBay thing comes up a lot regardless of signatures. But when you get to signatures, it becomes even more focused because I don't know, this is what I've experienced. And I think this is something you mentioned too, in our conversations before the show, is a graded collectible that's signed, something that was like a CGC witnessed comic book or something. I know they're doing the whole JSA thing. We'll get into that probably a little bit later on. But that process has been kind of true for a long time. And those have kind of a value that's a little bit easier to determine. It's a little bit easier to see, first of all, the grade is a little bit more nailed down. It's not a raw comic book. The signature, you can kind of see what the extra amount over what that comic book goes for just for that signature. That kind of makes sense. When it comes to raw comic books, it's almost like this Wild West. So it was a very fun topic, but man, there's definitely been some twists and turns about signing comic books that have come up, at least in my circles this week as well.
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting thing. It's an interesting kind of dilemma, right? I tend to, again, look at things through the eyes of systems, right? Trying to develop a system. When we talk about valuing graded or raw books, everybody has a system that they use, right? So, for me, it starts with some of the big, pricing sources, right? It's Go Collect, it's Comics Price Guide, it's Overstreet Access, it's
GPA analysis,
GPA, whatever.
Yeah.
And then what I actually do for my actual books that I sell is I look up the book on 4 different sites. I look it up on Overstreet's Access. I look it up on Comics Price Guide. I look it up on GPA, and I look it up on Go Collect if it's slabbed. And then I divide by 4. I add them all together and divide by 4. I find the average price, right?
Yeah.
And that tells me what that book is worth approximately. And what it does is it eliminates the whims of the collector thing.
Yeah.
So many people look at eBay sold listings. So many people look at
Go Collect.
Go Collect. Sorry,
It's
my
all good.
stomach is doing absolute flips.
If you need to dip, just let me know and I'll run with it. Okay.
They look at a couple of sites. They look at key collectors, and they say this is what the book is worth. When those sites are often very much catering to the whims of whatever's happening in the market, as opposed to talking about what actual books are worth.
Yeah.
Whereas something like Overstreet Access looks more at what a book is worth. Right? It doesn't react as quickly to a market trend. And the fact that that doesn't exist for a graded book or for a signed book is kind of a problem. Because it's my belief that every signature has an inherent value. Not necessarily an intrinsic value, there's a difference, but an inherent value. Be that a monetary value or a value to the collector who got it, or a value to the future of the collection.
Yeah.
If you have a current creator sign a current book right now and it goes in your collection and it lives there, when that creator is John Byrne in 30 years, that signature is going to be worth a lot more than it is now. But how do you value it now? And that led to this discussion of the trend of people who don't want signed books, of people who don't value signatures, of people who think, well, if it's signed, it's not something I want to collect, which is just bananas to me. And at the same time, I understand it on some level, especially if it's, oh, I wanted to meet that creator, but now that I've got a signed copy of the book, I don't need to. Or all I'm interested in are the big name signatures, McFarlane and whoever else.
Yeah.
Get those, I'll just send them into a private signing at CGC so they'll be gold labeled and, graded. And it makes me wonder, are we as a collecting community devaluing an important part of our industry?
Yeah. And so for me, look, a lot of this stuff, as pretty much every topic we come to, not every topic, but pretty much every topic we come to on this show, there's a recurring trend. And that trend is going to be that it's going to matter to you individually what is worth more or not worth more, whether something is valuable or not valuable. And I don't mean necessarily monetarily, whether or not it has any sentimental value to whatsoever. So one thing, as we're going through this conversation, Kyle's talked a little bit about his preferences. I'm going to discuss my personal preferences because that's a lens to talk about this stuff through. I really want all those in chat. By the way, shout out. We got Alex in the chat. We got ex-lieutenant in the chat. I saw Sean posting some comments in the chat too. We'll definitely get to your comments in a little bit here. But I just want to say thank you for being here. What I also want to see from you in chat is if you like signatures under certain conditions or for certain comic books, your rules about signatures, and also to go along with what basically inspired this topic, how you value those individual signatures on comic books and what that means to you. But one thing I definitely want to get into a little bit here, as we start talking about signatures. It's because the conversation tonight, even though that's what started it, it was the value of a signature. What does that add to like a raw comic book, for example? And why is that something that is kind of hard to pin down? And that was definitely the inspiration for this stream tonight, but it's not the only thing. We're also going to talk a little bit about things that are going on in the comic book scene right now. I made a post over on Instagram not that long ago about something that I've been seeing over the last couple days. And it relates to a fan who had Charlie Cox, who played Daredevil in the Netflix Daredevil series and is going to reprise that role for Daredevil Born Again on a new MCU show. And that person had Charlie Cox sign a Daredevil #1. And I made a post about it because I saw some replies to that thread. Actually, a bunch of posts that person made. And so I went and followed that person, showed them some support by liking some of their tweets and following them. And I also made a post about it because that person was receiving a lot of venom and a lot of hate about having the actor Charlie Cox sign their Daredevil #1. And the first thing I want to say is shout out to the vast majority of the people that follow me on Instagram when I made that post, because most of you were extremely level-headed in your replies to that post. And I think that some people thought maybe I was somehow saying, because I think looking at the post, it kind of reads a little bit like people are mad that this happened. I'm not one of those people. And I just want to point that out to frame this conversation. If you are somebody who's mad at that, that's okay. We can talk about that. But it's weird that there are people that are actually mad about what another collector did with their comic book, in my opinion, because that's a personal choice. And so that's something we're going to talk about later in the show as well. But let's get to this topic here a little bit about the idea of having your comic book signed. And this, to me, is you got to go all the way back. It's almost like a binary state. Comic book not signed, comic book signed. Because you start to kind of wheedle down the audience that you're looking for once that comic book is signed, especially when it comes in terms of what started the show, which is valuing signed comic books. Because it turns out there's a lot of people that actually don't like signed comic books. And I say that like that's a new thing, but I think it's something that if you've been collecting comic books, you've known that for a long time. There are people that view a creator signing a comic book, or for that matter, anybody signing a comic book, as defacing the comic book. There are people that view that's, think about anything you can do to a comic book. There are people that view cleaning and pressing comic books as restoration. There are people that view that as altering the comic book or damaging the comic book. People view slabbing as a cardinal sin. So it doesn't matter what you pick. You can find any topic, and comic book collectors will be divided on whether or not they think it's appropriate or not. So you've already kind of shrunk that prospective audience a little bit there once you talk about having a comic book signed. So, while I'm waiting for some of those replies to come through in chat and for you guys to let me know how you feel about signed comic books, I'll tell you a little bit about how I feel about signed comic books. So I grew up, the first time I think I ever had anything signed was a tiny little baseball card show in my hometown. And it was a couple baseball cards. I grew up in a small town in Washington. And so there were a couple Mariners there, Seattle Mariners from the baseball team. And they were not large names by any stretch of the imagination. At that point in the early 90s, the Mariners were not a very good team, much like they are now. And so it wasn't like a huge thing, but it was kind of fun to have these baseball cards that I'd collected to go meet that person and have them sign it. That was a cool thing. That was my first experience having somebody autograph something that was mine. And when I went to my first comic convention, I had comic books signed. I had like a Thunderbolts 1 signed by Kurt Busiek, for example, because I really, really love Thunderbolts 1. I love the twist in it. He was going to be at the show. That's really awesome. Other comics too, right? Yeah, I think signed comics are cool too, Big B. And so it's one of those things where, to me, it makes sense. To me, it's like a personal connection. You get to have that meeting and that interaction with a creator. And I totally get it. There are those that argue that it's cooler if you just go up and talk to them, have them sign an art print or something else, or not have them sign anything at all and just have a conversation with them. I think there's something to be said for that too. I'll admit that if you're at a busy convention and that's your opportunity to meet a creator and you have them sign something, sometimes that signing interaction can take up a portion of your time that you have with that creator. You know, if you have your comic in a bag and board and you're getting it out and you're discussing like, you know, hey, we're going to have the sign and we're going to pay for that, that can take up some of that time. And if that time with that creator is the only thing that really matters to you, it makes sense why you might say, well, the signing of the comic book isn't important. And I completely respect the fact that there's a lot of people out there that just think that signing a comic book is sacrilege. It's just something you shouldn't do to a comic book because it's defacing it. That's your own personal choice you get to make with your comic books. But I also respect those people, and I expect them to respect me in my decision to go have a comic book signed. I think that's something that, you know, we get to do as fans with what we love. Do you agree with that, Kyle? I know you probably just kind of hopped back in, but.
Well, I kind of like you with your non-Ken Griffey Jr. Seattle Mariners. I grew up standing in lines to get autographs from baseball and football players. I waited, and this is kind of where this whole thing starts for me about inherent value versus intrinsic value, right? I once waited in line 12 hours to get an autograph from Eddie George. He had just won the Heisman Trophy at Ohio State. He had just been drafted by the Houston Oilers. He hadn't played a game in the NFL yet. This is long before the greatest show on turf versus Steve McNair and Eddie George and the Oilers in the Super Bowl. This is a long time before that.
Okay.
Or was the Tennessee Titans by that point? But you know what I mean.
The Oilers thing kind of tripped in my brain for a second. I was like, wait.
Right. But it was that same team.
Yeah, for sure.
And the inherent value of it, to me, is I was a big kid. I'm a big grown-up. I was, for a kid of that age, people thought I was in my mid-20s when I was in my very early double digits. And Eddie looked at me and goes, "You're a lineman, right?" And I went, "Yeah." And he goes, "Hit the weight room." And I go, "Okay." He goes, "You start now, and by the time you're in high school and college, you are going to be unstoppable." And that was value to me, right? It was the interaction after the waiting in line and getting the jersey that he signed still hangs on my bedroom wall 25 years later.
Nice.
Right? And so I'm with you on that, right? It's the interactions plus the value of the signature. Now, that jersey is worth not a small amount of money to the right audience, but it's never going to be for sale.
Yeah.
So you talked about how no matter what you say, this community is going to be divided. And that's true, but I don't think we should be. And it's something that I was going to bring up later, but I'm going to mention it now because I think I'm going to paint with this brush the rest of the time. I can't tell you how to collect.
Mm-hmm.
You can't tell me how to collect. It's called a personal collection for a reason, not a community collection.
And in show.
Well, no, I wouldn't have stood in
though.
line to meet two no-name Seattle Mariners because I wouldn't have stood in line to meet Ken Griffey Jr. at that point.
Yeah.
Now, when he was a Red, maybe that'd be a little different. Ken Griffey Jr., Barry Larkin, some of those guys were, heroes growing up. But everybody gets their own kicks.
Well, and let me ask you. Sorry,
I just think that's an important thing to remember here early on in the show because it's going to come up again and again and again.
Yeah, 100%, and that's why I wanted to really drive home that point that it's an individual thing, and I completely echo what Kyle just said there. It's in the framework of what we just mentioned. Here's where I think the room for the conversation is. It's still cool to have the conversation about. Is it fun to have comic books signed? What are your personal rules for having comic books signed? What do you for example, here's a question for people. do you care if you had the comic book signed in front of you, or if you find a comic book that is signed by that creator? Some people have different levels of attachment for either of those scenarios. Some people don't want a comic book that wasn't signed in front of them. Some people think it's cool regardless of whether or not it was signed with that personal interaction. And that's like an example of the nuance that kind of creeps into this. The other level of nuance that I want to introduce to people, and again, I want to hear your opinions in the chat, is whether or not somebody worked on that comic book. The classic example is Stan Lee was a prolific signer, notorious for signing pretty much anything, especially Marvel, that was put in front of him. And a lot of those cases, Stan Lee's name, Stan Lee Presents, was a huge thing for a long time, pretty much the history of Marvel Comics. And obviously that's still there, but he didn't work on a lot of those comic books he signed, obviously. Like, he actually wrote relatively few of those comic books he signed. And there are people that don't want a Stan Lee signature on a comic book that Stan Lee didn't work on. I happen to kind of fall into that camp, by the way. But I'm not going to besmirch somebody who likes that. That's an important thing that we're going to keep bringing up. But I am curious.
I do want to caveat the Stan Lee conversation.
Sure.
There is so much question about Stan Lee late in life signatures.
Mm-hmm.
Because of the unfortunate situations that Stan was put into late in life. I'm not even going to say found himself in, but situations that he was put into late in life by people whom he believed had his best interest at heart. Whether they did or didn't is a debate for another day.
Yeah.
That Stan Lee, I think, falls into this other category. But a great example of similar but different is Neal Adams.
Mm-hmm.
Neal Adams was a prolific signer. I have Neal Adams' signature on books Neal Adams didn't work on. Because on more than one occasion, I'd set a stack of books down on his table and he'd just start signing. I go, wait. Oh, well, I didn't realize you worked on the Turtles. But that was because we were having a good talk. By that point, we knew each other well enough that he just assumed the stack of books I set down were for him.
Right.
So I think with the Stan Lee conversation, we have to take a step back a little bit just because of some of those question marks, right? But, I love hearing what other people's rules are.
Yeah.
So let's do this. We need to take our first break. But when we come back, let's get into what our rules are for signatures. Let's get into the story that, you brought me today that you kind of already mentioned, and kind of dig into that story a little bit and kind of talk about what signatures are worth from a personal standpoint, not a financial standpoint. Awesome. So we will be right back after these words from some people. If they ask you to buy something, buy it. Download our app on Google Play and the App Store. It's so simple, even my mommy can use it. In a world where you hit like and subscribe on our YouTube channel, that'd be really great. Thanks. Welcome back in, everybody. This is producer Kyle. And that's some other guy.
Want me to sign your comics?
Right, that's Bronze Age Nerd. He will sign whatever you ask him to sign.
You got it.
So long as it features a beard on the cover.
I'll sign any contract you put in front of me. I'll do whatever. No, I'm just kidding.
I've made that mistake. Don't do that.
Just get a band stamp.
Hey, now we're getting a little too close to that Stan Lee conversation there, Jay.
Yeah, there's some truth to that, unfortunately. Yeah, so we talked about earlier in the show. I just want to welcome anybody who's just now joining us. We've been talking about signatures and signed comic books tonight, and the conversation that started all this has been circling around the value, and that doesn't necessarily mean monetarily, although that was the original question that we had amongst ourselves, of a comic book when it's signed, and whether or not that signature adds certain kind of value, takes away from value. How do you define that? It's an interesting topic, and it's one that has become more relevant by events that have happened. And again, I just want to underline when I made that post, I just want to thank all the people that were responding tonight to the post I made about Charlie Cox signing that Daredevil #1, and how pretty much everybody that replied on my post was either like, why would anybody be mad about that, or expressing support, those kinds of things, right? And that's awesome to see, because I think that's the appropriate reaction to somebody who is clearly over the moon and thrilled and elated and excited about one of their comic books and an interaction they had with somebody who has an intrinsic value to that comic book now. And I think that's very important. I think that's a very important thing we don't want to get lost in the shuffle here. Is you can have your opinions about whether or not somebody should sign a comic book, but when I see somebody that happy, when I see a comic book fan that has had, kind of a dream moment come true for them, there ain't nothing in my heart but joy. Like, that's just joy for them. And I hope that's your reaction to that. If it's not, we definitely could talk about it, but try to come at it with some logic, and no hate for that individual would be my advice. So you can hate the practice. You can not like that comic book got signed by Charlie Cox. I understand that, but I recommend not putting that at that person that had that done.
True. It's an interesting thing, and I didn't really think about it until I was on my way to the show tonight. In my collection, I have 3 ASM 51s.
Okay.
I have an ASM 51 signed by the creative team, including, ironically, Stan Lee. Because, he was the editor on the book, and he gets a script credit. He wrote it. But signed by John Romita and Stan Rosen as well. Or Sam Rosen. Then I have another copy that has no signatures on it. And then I have a copy that's signed by Vincent D'Onofrio.
I was going to guess. Yeah, that's cool.
And what's cool is that when I got it signed, I knew Vincent D'Onofrio a little bit.
Right on.
I had done theater in high school with his nephew.
Okay.
So we had met just once or twice. Like, it was one of those things, like, when his nephew was the lead in the high school show, he would, at the time it was AIM video call the cast and, like, give us pep talks and stuff, and we met a couple of times when he would come to town and see his nephew. So I walk up to him and go, "Hey, you might not remember me, but I went to school with your nephew, Eric. And we did plays together." And he goes, "You were Big Julie in Guys and Dolls." And I go, "Yeah." He goes, "You were not bad." And I'm like, "Oh." And then I'm like, "Did you sign my Spider-Man?" And he goes, "Why?" And I go, "Well, because it's you on the cover, man." And it was just, again, it's the interaction was the value. But the story that the person on the Instagram post shared of him going, "Are you sure you want me to do this? Like, I know what this is. We both know what this is. Are you sure this is what you want to happen?" And her going, "Yes, I'm sure," is worth more than the book is worth.
Well, and Charlie Cox is, you can tell he's a fantastic actor, so I guess it's possible he's acting. But he's going to remember that. I know he signed other ones too, but he had probably, I'm guessing some of those might have been like at an event where people are sitting in their books or whatever. He personally had this interaction with that fan. Like, he's going to remember that. I mean, think about where he's at. He's coming back and going to be reprising that role. He's very steeped in that fandom right now. From hearing him talk, he has a respect for the comic books. She's mentioning in the post that he's being very gentle with the comic book and having a lot of respect for it, asking those kinds of questions. There is nothing for me, hey, again, people could have their own opinions. I'm interested to hear them, but there's nothing in this interaction for me to be mad about at all. Like, it's just wholesome all around.
It's true.
Yeah.
I mean, and that's the thing, right? Is there's a level of I know comic creators who aren't nice to the books you set in front of them.
Yep.
They just pencil whip them. I know when they do these big signings at CGC that these guys are just pencil whipping these books.
Mm-hmm.
They're not taking the time to talk to you, to interact with you, to pardon my French, to give a shit about the thing set in front of them.
Yeah.
Now, they might be, but so much stuff gets sent in, they don't really have time to. Right? Like, if there's 100,000 books for you to sign, which I imagine there's not, but you know what I mean. There's
for some of these people, I think there might be.
Well, I know they cap these things, but if there's 1,000 books in front of you and you've only got 4 hours, you don't have time to be like, okay, now this one's for Julie, and I want to take real good care of Julie's book. It's not that way.
But hold on, before we move on from this, that said, I do actually want to share this. I'm not, generally speaking, a fan, all this said, of having celebrities as opposed to comic book creators sign your comic books. So I just want to mention that because we kind of were talking about our personal opinions about this stuff. However, I've done it. I've got a signed Katie Sackhoff has signed a copy of a comic book with Bo-Katan on the cover. It's her first cover appearance. That to me is a really awesome comic book, and I'm going to always enjoy that. But I have my own specific rules for what is, Katie Sackhoff has portrayed Bo-Katan in voice, in live action since the character was created. She's part of that character. So like for me, that's kind of where my exception is. Now, please understand that I'm not saying, obviously, if you listen to anything I said tonight, I'm not going to crap on anybody else for having their book signed by a celebrity. Right. I'm not going to crap on Kyle for Vincent D'Onofrio signing his Spider-Man 51. But generally speaking, it's not usually for me. And if it was, if I wanted Charlie Cox to sign a comic book, for example, I'd probably pick like a photo cover or maybe a facsimile of Daredevil 1 or, maybe a more modern comic book if I was going to have him sign a comic book. That's kind of me. What I would really want him to sign is like a 4K Blu-ray of Daredevil season 1 or something like that. I think that'd be awesome too. But
sure,
hey, everybody's got their own opinions on it.
But like you said with Katie Sackhoff, it's not dissimilar to me of having Vincent D'Onofrio sign Daredevil or Kingpin, or
totally
my off at the framer right now, Amy Jo Johnson signed Pink Ranger book.
There you go.
Because Amy Jo Johnson will always be the Pink Ranger, and anybody who says otherwise can fight me. I mean, I know how old I am, and I remember when that show came out. I will fight on that hill. But what are your rules, Bronze? What are your rules for signatures?
Yeah, and so obviously I just kind of revealed one there. It's a very nuanced rule with the whole celebrity thing, because it's case by case. For example, if I had a Hulk 181, I wouldn't want Hugh Jackman to sign it. That's just me. If somebody gave me a Hulk 181 signed by Hugh Jackman, I'd be pretty in favor of that. But when it comes to regular autos, my rules have definitely shifted. I at first when I was I only wanted to meet the creator and I wanted to have them sign the comic book that was usually something I owned already. It wasn't something I bought for them to sign. That was kind of the ideal situation for me. As I started to go to more conventions, I would have this situation come up where it's like, since I sold most of my collection, I actually don't have a comic book that person worked on anymore. I really liked their work. I really want to go meet them. And so I would start to buy comic books for them to sign. And then I eventually, I think kind of pretty much at the onset of seeing conventions being shut down for a while, I think that's kind of about the first time I did it, I started submitting to the CGC in-house signing events. And that was kind of a weird philosophical thing for me because, like we were just talking about with the, the example, there's no personal interaction there. It's the exact opposite of it. It's I'm paying for this person to sign the book. I know my comic book is being signed by them at this CGC headquarters, but it's not anything like that convention or personal interaction. I had a bunch of Chris Claremont books signed, for example. I'm a huge X-Men fan, if you guys might know that. And for me, having heard stories about Chris Claremont taking forever, with each person in line and huge lines, whether or not, I've kind of heard both ways, but I do know it's a huge line and it's going to take you a long time to get through it. And I didn't want to have to worry about, having the money, having the specific, books with me. Some of those books are extremely valuable. So sending them in, having them insured through shipping, that made a lot of sense. And now if I have the opportunity to meet Chris Claremont, I can bring some other stuff for him to sign and just have that longer conversation with him that's more focused. So those are kind of my main rules are, I really like to have the personal interaction, but it's not required. I have rules for going outside that. I do have the rule though, where I pretty much only want people that worked on that comic book to sign it, unless, I have those exceptions, but that's kind of me. Like if the creator of the character wants to sign a comic book that they're in, that's kind of another area I might be willing to go down. But yeah, that's kind of my rules. How about you, Kyle?
Well, it's that time of the night where Kyle says something that's going to be mildly controversial. The cult of CGC is ruining so much of this hobby for me. People are so cultishly loyal to CGC that I think it is a big reason why this debate even exists.
Mm-hmm.
For years, CGC looked at books that were signed, but they didn't stand there and pretend to watch them as though they were just books somebody scribbled on. So my rules are I don't have books CGC witnessed, ever. I will with CBCS because CBCS will do, and the caveat is this is now changing. This is one of these rules that's in flux.
Yeah.
It was CGC or CBCS because CBCS was willing to authenticate my signatures. Right?
Mm-hmm.
Now that CGC will do it, I'm more open to that process. I will never send a book in. I did it one time and I got burned so bad I'll never do it again. So if I'm not there to witness the signature myself, I won't do it. I don't generally have actors sign books unless I'm doing it specifically, like K-Pop said earlier. And like like my example with my 51s, right? I have a copy with SIGs from the creators. I have a copy with SIGs from the actor, and I actually have one that's not signed at all.
It's the best of all worlds right there.
Right. And it's because now I have everything I need, right?
Yeah.
If it comes out that Vincent D'Onofrio is some kind of monster, which never gonna happen because the guy's the sweetest guy ever, I can just shelve that book and not deal with it. Right? Just like my Warren Ellis signatures and my, some other people's signatures.
Too many others, unfortunately.
But I don't want a signed art print. I don't want your convention signature. Scotty Young is one that's notorious for this. He'll put a thing out and say signatures are free with a donation to Hero Initiative. But then he's basically just initialing your book. He's putting his mark on it. He's not signing your book. I don't want that. How much for you to actually sign my book?
Yeah.
Sean posted a thing about how when he met Chip Zdarsky, Chip said it was $10 for a signature or free if you let it sign it to his name. So if it's to Sean, it's free. If it's just his signature, it's $10. Sign it to me then. I'll still give you the $10, but sign it to me. If that's the way you're drawing your line, fine. I'm still willing to pay you your $10 for your signature, but still sign it to me.
You know, that's a weird one for me. That to me is actually the nuance here that I'm all in it for, because I don't like the personalized signature. And for me, I'm a little bit with Sean here. For me, I like it if I actually know the person. Like, I've had some really good, I guess I'll say relationships with a couple creators. If they made out and said, to me, for me, I actually would really value that. Larry Hama is a creator like that. He said, hey, I'll sign the first, I think it was 2 for free. Who I'm making them out to, the rest you got to pay for. And I had him do it, but I actually, part of me wanted to be like, no, just, here, I'll pay for all of them. But it was kind of one of those ones that was on the bubble for me, because it's just something like, I don't want my name on the book. Like, it's not about me, I guess.
Well,
that's me.
The second part of that to me, right, is if I want you to sign it without my name on it, I will reach out to you and set up a private signing. Right? I did that most recently with Glenn Fabry a couple years ago. And I'm going to use that because the Kevin Eastman example is so different than most people's interactions. So I'm going to do Glenn Fabry. I had him sign a Preacher #1. He's signing for free if he made it out to you. My Preacher #1, my Preacher #13, to Kyle, signed by Glenn Fabry.
Yeah.
But then I reached out to him a month before the show and said, hey, I have a whole run of Preacher I would like for you to sign. It's signed by literally everybody else. Can we set up a private signing and establish a rate per book to have you sign these? And he was real accommodating. It was not that expensive. And it worked out really well, because now I have my books I can sell because they're not made out to me, but I have the 2 that I'm never going to get rid of in my box with my name on them. So it's one of those things, is that's not the average person's experience.
Right. That's what I was just going to say, is like, I mean, it's a wonderful idea, and it's worth trying no matter who you are or what kind of connections you have or don't have, because you never know. But I do think some people are going to be unable to attain the connection with these creators. Some you can easily, and it might surprise you which ones those are in some cases, but
right, like I said, it's not the average person's experience, so I take it with a grain of salt. But I also have experiences with creators who, if you want me to sign more than one book, if you want me to not personalize the book, don't even get in my line. And I think that's garbage.
Yeah.
Because that's just not how this should work. It should be a two-way street. I'm willing to pay you for your signature, but I don't want you to write my name on it. And there's an artist who I ran into at Comics Pro who I cornered him at Comics Pro and said, you did this to me a few years ago, and I think it's bullshit. And I called him on it, and he goes, you know what it was, but I got tired of these guys bringing up a whole short box of my work and asking me to sign them all. You come up to me with 1 or 2 books, okay, fine, we'll talk. But
yeah, there goes the Big B's comment earlier in the chat about, in the late 80s and early 90s, you'd have greedy people pulling out a whole wagon of books for people to sign.
Right. No, it's true. Still was happening in the late 2000s.
Still happens today. I mean, in some situations.
Right. It's one of those things, is that I recognize that these artists and creators have to draw a line somehow, right? And if that line is I'm personalizing these books, then fine, I'm going to respect your boundary.
Yeah.
Even if that means I like it a little bit less, I'm going to respect your boundary. So
yeah, I think that's part of my philosophy towards the whole signature topic and just preferences is kind of stay water on a lot of it, because My opinion on it has evolved over time, and you do kind of end up having those kind of unique interactions with some creators, at least in my experience, where it kind of feels like, oh, I might actually be willing to change how I view this based on how this interaction went. There's people I've talked to at a show and had a random, encounter with where I never would have really sought them out to have them sign my stuff, but now I want to have that, kind of physical memory of something that for that interaction, and
Right.
sometimes, and somebody else mentioned it in the chat, sometimes that's a photo. I think it was Joe mentioned it. Sometimes that's just a photo with that person, and that's totally fine too. That can be it for a lot of people. Some people, the signature doesn't matter, but that's a whole other thing we didn't even get into. Sometimes people, and this sort of makes sense for a lot of reasons, they need to have that photo or video evidence of that collectible being signed too.
Well, and again, it's one of those things that the photo, I think, is a great example, right? When I see an actor, I like getting it signed 8x10. Right? I have used to be in this room. It's in that room now. Signed 8x10s of everyone who was in Band of Brothers who went on to be in a Marvel or a DC or Neil McDonough, Michael Cudlitz, a bunch of these guys, right? That I run into Scott Grimes in their Band of Brothers gear, right?
Right on.
8x10s. Those guys aren't making comics, right? And that's a way to do it, right? Is getting your photo taken with the creator.
Yeah.
Is a great value add for me. I still want the signature. So we need to take a break, but real quick, I want to mention something that Southern Comic Geek posted here. Had an artist this past week who was charging $10 each, but $100 for a certain key issue, even though I wasn't getting it graded. I think for me to speak on that, I would need more information. I know there are creators who have tenuous relationships with some of the biggest books they've done. Chris Claremont being one of them. That they'll sign it, but they want a premium for signing it because they just don't want to deal with it. Right? They want a premium for signing books that they'd rather not have a conversation about again. And so I can respect that, but I would need more information to be able to really speak to it,
Because there are also creators who purely are asking more because they know that it is perceived as a more desirable comic book.
Right. They believe you're going to flip it.
Yeah.
And that's
true, graded or not, too, in those cases. Like, there's one person I'm thinking of specifically who I know is kind of notorious for that. But yeah, that's something I think we definitely should talk about a little bit too, is that practice, because we're it's in the wheelhouse.
Right.
Talking about values.
We are quickly running out of time for tonight's show. So let's do this. Let's take a quick second break, and we'll be back in just a minute. And we'll discuss what Southern Comic Geek is talking about and some other things here right after this. What do you call the place on Spider-Man's wrists where the webs come out? His website. I hate myself for writing that joke, but you'd make me feel so much better if you just visited our website. We have links to our merch, new release lists, all the show info, and so much more. TheEXPLive.com. Twitch. It's not just what happens when you have too many energy drinks anymore. Check out our content over there, too. Welcome back in, everybody. We're talking about signed comics and the value of signatures. I was
just going to say, we do have very little time left in the show. One thing I want to let you know is we are going to get to some of your comments in this final section. You all been putting in some great ones, and we really appreciate that. So thanks for doing that. As always, we appreciate all of you commenting in the chat.
Yeah. I'm trying to wrap my brain around Josh Middleton and Nyx 3. I don't think his signature raises the value on that book as much as he thinks it does. And being who I am in the part of the world where I exist, I might have said that to him.
Well, for that matter, I think that's true for a lot of these creators that do that for certain books, and it's usually at first appearance or whatever. Look, and that kind of goes to the heart of what started this. It sometimes a creator signature will add value to a comic book, sure, and sometimes it will add value much further down the road. There's certain books that signed by Stan Lee, for example. We mentioned him earlier, that kind of thing that would be Jack Kirby many years down the road, because they're no longer signing, because there was only so many copies they signed. People are going to be looking for that. It's much more desirable. There are certain comic books where there are so many signed comic books out there by that person that it's insane to think that it would be worth that much more just because they signed it. But people definitely want to get paid on it. And so, that kind of speaks to the fact that there is some value in the market for these kind of signatures too. Oh, interesting. He doesn't like X23? Interesting. I never heard that before.
Alex, they don't anymore. And again, we kind of discussed that already. We can move on from that point of view. Yeah, I think the other problem is, and this is something that I'm not saying it in the sense of trying to knock anyone down or diminish anybody's work. But there are artists who think they're better than they are. And that kind of leads us to our topic for next week, ironically. But
true.
There are artists who think that their value is higher than it is. And at the end of the day, value is in the eye of the beholder. I do think, like I started the show, we need to have some sort of system put in place to value a signature. What is my Will Eisner signed book worth beyond the value of the book because it's signed by Will Eisner? What is my TMNT1 worth beyond the value of a TMNT1 because it's signed by literally every founder from Mirage Comics, including the guys who didn't work on TMNT? It has some value beyond what TMNT1 is worth, but I have no way of knowing. And then there is the other value, right? The value that your interaction holds.
Yeah, absolutely. That can't be understated.
When you have an interaction with Michael Golden where he wants $40 more for Avengers 10 than he does for anything else, does that sour your interaction with him?
Well, and so I need to chime in on that concept too, because here's my thoughts on this. When a creator says, I'm taking X comic book up to them, not X23, I'm just using that as a generic placeholder, and they say, oh, hey, this comic book, I actually charge $100 per signature on it instead of $10 per signature on it. And especially for me, if that answer is because you're getting it witnessed by CGC, I look forward to the day that I have that interaction with the creator, because it's going to be a strange one for me, because I'm going to fire back with like, why? And even though I know what their answer probably is, because to me, that is a weird thought. Oh, because you're going to turn around and sell it is kind of the answer there, but I'm not. In most cases, if I'm getting a comic book signed at a show, I want it witnessed as especially, I know now JSA is authenticating CGC signatures, and CBCS has been doing the witness for a long time, and then they'll do the verified signature program. And I know you can do those things, but if I was doing it, it would have been just to like, hey, I had this signed by this person this day, lock it in. And I have my own reasons for slabbing comic books in my personal collection that have nothing to do with current resale value or because I'm looking to flip it down the road. And we've talked about that before. But there are reasons that exist for that. Just because I want it slabbed doesn't mean I want to sell it. And implying that that's what I'm going to do with it is a little offensive to me. Like, that's just, right. I understand some people do it, of course, but anyways.
Right. And again, I'll walk up to a creator and say, I've walked up to several creators, and several of whom have become friends since then, and said, I was going to get this book signed and I was going to get this book graded, and CBCS was here to witness it. But because you're charging extra, instead, I'm not going to get the book signed. I'm not going to get it graded, and now you're taking money off of your table and his. And just walked away. There's a big name who's come up in the chat tonight, who I did that to, and they're still mad at me for. Because I made kind of a scene in front of their line. You mean to tell me this guy waited in line 3 hours with me for you to pull this crap? Nah. And if you think I'm not going to tell the con promoter, you got another thing coming.
Yeah.
And again, I recognize that I don't necessarily have the same interactions with people that others do. Right? I exist in sort of a weird bubble in this business where not only am I a retailer, but I'm a little bit of an influencer, and I represent several big name artists at conventions. But it's the premise of the thing. It's the concept of the thing that gives me problems.
So one thing we did kind of tackle some of the comments. We are getting towards the end of the show. One thing, Kamikaze made a point that goes back to the original question you had, Kyle, that kind of sparked the inspiration for the show. When it comes to valuing what any comic is worth, I think this comment does apply in one way. It's worth what someone is willing to pay for it at that time. But I think it's also in another way a little reductive, because that's true for any comic book. That's true for any item or good of any kind. We're trying to kind of quantify a little bit what is the value on a comic book that is signed in general. Like what could you look at your collection and kind of say, okay, this signature, and to me, I think as we kind of get to the end of the show, we should probably actually answer that question for ourselves and kind of wrap that up in a tight little bow. For me, it depends on the factors we've talked about tonight. Whether or not it's graded is one factor. Whether or not it's by a living creator or a deceased creator is another factor. Whether or not they worked on that comic book or it's somebody who is just associated with that character or that comic book is another factor. And I have to take all those things into account, because I will tell you, like, I'm going to go to a con this weekend. There's probably a couple comic books I'm going to walk out of there with that'll be signed that I'll have paid, $10 to have signed each or whatever. And I will say that they're probably worth the exact same amount that I walked in with them, possibly less to some people. So it's really one of those things. I think it does depend on the comic book. It depends on all the factors involved. Unfortunately, it's not something that to me is easy to quantify, but I do think it's a fascinating thought experiment. But I think it's so relative to those variables I just mentioned that it's really hard to come down with a matrix that's going to give you that kind of an answer for every comic book.
Well, and I'm going to say to what Kamikaze said that's wrong. It's not worth what someone will pay for it. If I ask however many of you are in chat right now, which is worth more, a Will Eisner signature or a Jack Kirby signature, I'm guessing that most of the chat will pick wrong. Just guessing. That most of the chat will pick the signature that's actually worth less money than out of those two. And if I said Will Eisner or Rob Liefeld or Will Eisner or Todd McFarlane, I'm guessing we would get the same result.
As you're thinking, people go with a more popular creator?
I'm thinking that people don't know what the actual rarity, scarcity, and value of a book is.
Yeah.
Of a signature. Like, and that's it. It's K-pop said it. Neither. I don't want either of those. And that's wrong. Because these signatures have a inherent value. Just because you don't want them doesn't mean they're valueless.
Yeah, but the question you just posed as hypothetical wasn't about value necessarily.
Right,
it was
right.
about whether or not you want them signed.
And everybody who's saying Kirby would be wrong. Kirby signed way more than Eisner.
You want that Disney lookalike signature.
Kirby signed way more than Eisner. Those signatures are much easier to get. That's not to say they're easy, but they're much easier to get than an Eisner signature. And so when I pose the question, which signature is more valuable, I'm not asking for your opinion. I'm asking which signature is more valuable. And so if I ask you which signature is more valuable, that's what we're talking about. And to say that the market sets the value or that they're not valuable because you don't want them is diminishing the work of those creators, is diminishing the value that they've put into this industry. And I think that's an important thing to remember, is that just because the market doesn't know what the market should know doesn't mean that the signature or that the market is right. It just means that there's a blind spot.
Yeah, it does touch upon one other interesting point, which, Oz just made another comment too that kind of reminds me of this. There is a bit of a difference too inherent in what is something worth on the market versus what is the long-term value of that collectible when the market corrects.
Right.
And so there's a bit of a nuance there too.
Market blind spots happen all the time.
Yeah.
I mean, right now, if you look at the car market, what Tesla stocks go for is a highly inflated number because people aren't investing in Rivian, right? It's a market blind spot to a company that's probably actually worth more, right? And that's what I'm getting at, is this whole thing started for me over, we need to determine what things are actually worth.
Yeah.
Versus what is the perceived value. In 2020, the perceived value of a Venom number 3 was way higher than the perceived value of a Venom Lethal Protector number 1. But in reality, they're probably much more equal. And that's the conversation that I wanted to have here.
Yeah.
Is this idea that just because it's not worth it to you doesn't mean it's not worth it.
No, and that's 100% a point that is worth making. And it's also, there is this tendency in the market. You mentioned you were going around having this conversation with dealers and that kind of thing. And one of the things that got brought up was the eBay price. And this is what it's going for on eBay. There's also this kind of knee-jerk, well, the last sold on eBay is. And I'm not saying it's not a valuable data point. It absolutely is a valuable data point. But it is not a valuable data point in a vacuum. You can't just say, well, the last sold on eBay was this, so that's what it's worth.
Right.
Okay, so it's never going to sell for more or less ever again. It never sold for more or less before that. There's not other factors that are creating that value for that comic book. That seller isn't using certain techniques in their listing to help maximize what it sold for. In fact, on my show last week, I had Ryan from Automatic Comics on. We were talking about the 9.9 CGC explosion. And one of the things that he posted about recently on his, because I'm following him on Instagram more, I'm seeing more posts from him. He talked about how it was really funny that he had an ASM 252 9.8 newsstand listed for X dollars. I think it was like $1,500, something like that. And an auction had just ended where the auction for the exact same comic book sold for a lot more than that. When anybody who was bidding you could see 70 bidders or whatever on that, and, maybe that was 20 real bidders at the end there, could have went and bought it now for less money than they paid on the auction. Those kind of factors are the kind of things that come into play on that most recent sale.
Right. And again, that was where this conversation started, is that inherent value versus intrinsic value versus perceived value.
Yep.
And how we don't have systems in place for these things. And then, it all kind of ballooned into this, well, what's the point of a signed book? And why do you get them signed? And what are your rules for getting them signed? I think we all need to remember that, and again, I can't tell you how to collect or not to collect. But what I can do, and I can really drive home the idea, is that if we all just go based on what the whims of the market are, we're shortchanging an awful lot. If we all just go based on what the whims of the modern collector are, or the collector right now are, we're shortchanging an awful lot. We're diminishing an awful lot. But if we're all willing to say, you know what? I don't see the value in that, even though you do, we can have a conversation about why my value is my value and your value is your value. Right? I told K-pop she was wrong earlier. I don't necessarily think K-pop is wrong for her. But that is not what K-pop is willing to spend, is not what the value of the book is. It's just not the value of the book for her. Yeah. Which is kind of what goes back to that earlier conversation about the Charlie Cox thing. I don't see the value of Charlie Cox's signature on a Daredevil #1 nearly in the same way the person on the internet did. That's not to say that Charlie Cox's signature on a Daredevil #1 isn't valuable. And that's the difference. And Ozzy, that's why I keep making this point, that the market doesn't know anything. The market is dictated by people who are making split-second decisions based on their own understanding, not based on a full understanding. Which is why when we talk about pricing books, right, we talk about multiple data points. Bron said it. Having more data points is better.
Yeah, it's like, so the analogy I want to use for people is that my closing thought on this, when it comes to that topic, is that sale is one frame of film. Great. That's, I own some frames of some cool films. That's one of the things I collect, and I have some cool ones. But when you start to play that whole picture with all those 24 frames per second rolling by, that's when you start to get a little bit different picture of what the true value can be. And I hope when people have that conversation, they understand that the market isn't just transactions. It's also influences by external forces, influences by emotion, FOMO, all these different things that can be factored into that. There's a lot of factors. And as long as people are willing to have the conversation, that's fine. I see the market will decide thrown out there a lot as almost like a phrase that we use in this community. And some people are using it correctly. Some people are just kind of shotgunning it out there because it's a buzzword, so to speak, a buzz term. But yeah, I think that, one thing I just want to reiterate at the end of the show for anybody who is just now tuning in, or, saw any of my posts earlier on Instagram, I think it behooves you to let collectors collect the way they want to collect, and just be happy that they are collecting. Be happy they are fans. Be happy we have more people in this hobby that are enjoying themselves and having fun. Whether you like signed comics, whether you don't like signed comics, first of all, those let us know in the chat. We really appreciate it. We all have different opinions on this. A lot of us have some overlap, but it's usually a little bit of a unique opinion. If you're watching on the rewind, leave a comment below to let us know what those opinions are, because we're probably going to talk about this topic again, and we want to know what you had to say about it. Same thing with the topic suggestion that just got put in the chat by Jay. We do have a link where you can go suggest ideas to us. Sean said he suggested something about remarks that we're going to review after the show. So there are lots of different ways to get a hold of us to suggest topics. And it's important because, Kyle and I had this conversation last week, like he mentioned, and then we started talking about this. And then I see things sparking off in the community almost by happenstance that are related to this idea about this concept of signatures. So I think it's kind of this one fun congruence here of different events. We'd love to hear what you guys have to say about that.
Absolutely. So next week, we are going to be talking about witch hunts. And are we witch hunting people who deserve it? And are we witch hunting people who don't? Do you know what I'm talking about? If you don't, that's good, because I kind of forgot to. So we will see you all next week here on Devil's Advocates. Bronze, thank you for being here. Give the wife, I know you guys have a thing, so give the wife my love. We will see everybody next week.
Thanks, everybody.
Join the party. Head over to our Linktree to find all the links for everywhere the experience is all the time.